You are not buying growth, sir. You are buying 12 months before the company runs out of cash. Hannah Pierce said it quietly, with one hand resting beside the untouched espresso she had just placed on the table. For a moment, no one inside the private dining room of the Calder house moved. Marcus Ellison had asked the question as a joke. His investment chief had smiled before Hannah answered. The attorney beside him had lowered her eyes toward the contract, already expecting the waitress to retreat into embarrassment. Instead, the room had gone still around a single sentence. Marcus looked at Hannah, then at the financial report open near his father's fountain pen. What did you say? His voice was calm, but the amusement had disappeared. Hannah stood in her black service uniform beneath the amber light of the brass wall lamps. She was 31, composed, and almost invisible among the polished wood, white linen, and tailored suits. Northline Freight is reporting profit, she said, but it is using tomorrow's cash to survive today. Richard Voss, Marcus's chief investment officer, leaned back in his chair. That is a dramatic conclusion from someone who glanced at one page. Hannah looked at the appendix beside his hand. 3 pages. Richard smiled without warmth. Then perhaps we should add financial analysis to the dessert menu. A few people at the table gave the polite laugh he expected. Marcus did not. He studied Hannah with the same expression he used when an unfamiliar number appeared in a deal he believed he already understood. Northline Freight employed nearly 8,000 people and moved goods through 32 states. The proposed acquisition was valued at $860 million. Marcus had spent 6 months preparing to sign. He had brought the fountain pen his father once used for every major agreement, a dark blue instrument with a narrow gold clip worn smooth by time. It lay beside the signature page as if the decision had already been made. Hannah glanced at it, then at the espresso growing cold. Show me, Marcus said. Richard turned toward him. Marcus, this is unnecessary. If she is wrong, it will take 1 minute. Hannah did not reach for the report. Page 142. The attorney flipped through the binder and stopped. Hannah continued. Northline's operating cash flow is negative, even though net income increased 22%. That means the profit is not becoming money the company can actually use. Marcus looked down. The number was there. Richard spoke quickly. Seasonal timing. Freight companies often carry uneven receivables. Hannah nodded once. That would explain 1 quarter. Not 3. She pointed toward a footnote. They sold customer invoices to a finance company before those customers paid. That brought future cash into the present. Marcus's eyes moved across the page. Factoring. Yes, sir. But the agreement expires in 90 days. Richard folded his hands. It can be renewed. Only if the lender agrees, Hannah said. And the lender has already reduced the advance rate. The attorney looked up. Marcus turned another page. His expression changed by a fraction. Hannah saw it. She had spent years reading financial reports the way other people read faces. The truth usually appeared in what moved against the rest. Here, profits rose. Cash fell. Supplier payments slowed. Repair costs disappeared from expenses and reappeared as assets. Customer deposits were being treated like working capital. Each choice could be defended alone. Together, they formed a clock. Marcus tapped the report with one finger. How long? Before the cash problem becomes impossible to hide? Hannah asked. Yes. She looked at the quarter-end covenant printed in smaller type beneath the debt summary. Less than a year. Possibly 1 quarter. Richard let out a controlled breath. This is speculation. Hannah met his gaze. Then page 187 will prove me wrong. Marcus turned to the page. At the top was a lending condition requiring Northline to maintain at least $80 million in unrestricted cash. The reported balance was $112 million. Hannah waited until Marcus found the definition beneath it. $34 million belonged to customer deposits and could not be used freely. Another $21 million was pledged against fuel contracts. The room became quiet enough for the ventilation above them to be heard. Marcus lifted his eyes from the page. That leaves $57 million. Hannah shook her head. Not after the fuel payment due next month. She looked at the fountain pen beside his hand. If you sign tonight, the company may breach its loan agreement before you finish announcing the acquisition. 2 hours earlier, the private dining room at the Calder house had been prepared for certainty. The table was set for 8, the financial binders arranged in neat stacks, and a leather folder containing the preliminary purchase agreement placed beside Marcus Ellison's chair. Outside, Manhattan traffic moved in silver streams beneath a steady evening rain. Inside, every detail suggested control. Hannah Pierce had been assigned to the room after another server left unexpectedly to handle a family emergency. She entered carrying water, coffee, and a tray of warm bread while Marcus's advisors discussed the final price of Northline freight. $860 million passed between them as casually as the cost of dessert. Hannah kept her eyes lowered, but she listened. Marcus spoke in short sentences. Richard Voss answered quickly, often before the attorneys finished their questions. Across the table, two Northline representatives repeated the same message. Revenue was rising, margins were improving, and the company needed only a strong owner to reach its full value. Hannah had heard that language before. Years earlier, she had worked as a senior credit analyst for a national ratings firm. Her job was not to predict which companies would become famous. It was to identify which ones might fail before lenders noticed the danger. She had learned that businesses rarely collapsed in one dramatic moment. They weakened quietly. Supplier payments slowed. Receivables grew faster than sales. Repair costs moved into categories that made profits look cleaner. Cash left through doors no presentation mentioned. 3 years earlier, Hannah had found those same signs inside a manufacturing company preparing to borrow hundreds of millions of dollars. Her supervisors asked her to soften the warning. The client was important, they said. The risks could be explained later. Hannah refused to sign the favorable report. Within months, she was removed from major accounts. Soon after, a restructuring eliminated her position. No one called it punishment. That was what made it effective. She took the job at the Calder House while studying for a forensic accounting certification, telling herself the move was temporary. Still, old habits remained. She noticed when people avoided numbers. She noticed when confidence arrived before evidence. During the first course, Richard opened a summary showing Northline's profit had increased 22%. Marcus tapped the page with his father's fountain pen. "That is the number the board will understand," he said. Hannah placed a plate beside him and saw the cash flow table beneath the summary. Net income was rising. Operating cash was falling. She moved away before anyone noticed her looking. During the second course, the Northline chief financial officer explained that delayed vendor payments were part of a routine efficiency program. Hannah heard Richard call it disciplined working capital management. She heard the attorney ask whether any debt conditions were at risk. Richard answered no before the chief financial officer opened his mouth. That answer stayed with her. At the service station, Hannah reviewed the restaurant check for the room. Every bottle, every course, every service charge had been verified twice before reaching Marcus. Yet the acquisition report beside his plate contained footnotes no one seemed eager to read once. When she returned with coffee, she saw the lending covenant on page 187 and the restricted cash definition 3 pages later. The figures did not reconcile. The company reported $112 million in cash, but much of it could not be spent freely. A fuel payment due the following month would reduce the usable amount even further. Hannah placed an espresso beside Marcus and glanced once toward the appendix. He noticed. Richard noticed too. "Something interesting?" Marcus asked. Hannah stepped back. "Only the numbers, sir." Richard smiled. "Careful, Marcus. Your waitress may be performing due diligence." The table laughed. Marcus looked at Hannah with the casual amusement of a man expecting entertainment. Then he lifted his fountain pen and asked the question that would change the room. "All right. Financial advice. Buy or walk?" Hannah looked at Marcus Ellison's fountain pen, then at the page beside his untouched espresso. The question had been offered as entertainment, but the answer carried too much consequence to soften. "You are not buying growth, sir. You are buying 12 months before the company runs out of cash." The laughter ended before she finished the sentence. Marcus lowered the pen. Richard Voss gave a short smile, as though the room had misunderstood the joke. "That is a dramatic claim from 3 pages of footnotes." Hannah kept her eyes on Marcus. "The profit is real on paper. The cash is not." Marcus leaned back slightly. "Explain." Hannah pointed toward the operating cash flow statement without touching the binder. Northline reported higher earnings because several costs were moved out of current expenses. Major truck repairs were classified as long-term assets. That makes this quarter look stronger, but the money still left the bank. The Northline chief financial officer cleared his throat. Capitalizing fleet improvements is standard practice. For improvements, Hannah said, not for routine repairs on vehicles already in service. The attorney beside Marcus turned to the fixed asset schedule. Her finger stopped midway down the page. There are $48 million in newly capitalized fleet costs. Richard answered before anyone asked him. The accounting team reviewed those classifications. Hannah looked toward him. Then they should also have reviewed the supplier aging report. Marcus turned another section of the binder. Hannah continued. Northline is paying vendors an average of 19 days later than it did last year. That delay created temporary cash, but it cannot continue without damaging fuel, maintenance, and parts relationships. One of the Northline representatives shifted in his chair. Marcus noticed. How much cash did the delayed payments create? He asked. The chief financial officer hesitated. Approximately $31 million. And the receivables sale? Marcus asked. Richard opened his mouth, but Marcus raised one hand. Let him answer. The chief financial officer looked down. $46 million. Hannah spoke quietly. That is $77 million pulled forward or held back from normal operations. Without it, the reported cash balance falls below the loan requirement. The attorney began writing notes. Marcus looked again at page 187. His father's pen remained beside his hand, but he no longer reached for it. You said 12 months, he told Hannah. Then you said possibly 1 quarter. 12 months is the longest the company can maintain the appearance, she replied. The loan covenant may fail sooner. Richard folded his arms. You are assuming the lender will refuse a waiver. No, Hannah said. I am assuming the waiver will be expensive. Marcus's gaze sharpened. Why? Hannah pointed to the factoring agreement. The company buying Northline's receivables also holds an option to provide emergency credit if the cash covenant is breached. The rate is not shown in the summary. It is buried in the attachment. The attorney opened the reference file. 14% interest plus an 8% origination fee. No one spoke for several seconds. On an emergency loan of $200 million, the fee alone would be $16 million. Marcus looked toward Richard. Why was this not in the investment summary? Richard's expression remained controlled. Because the facility has not been activated. But someone negotiated it, Hannah said. Richard turned toward her. You are making connections without understanding the transaction. Hannah met his gaze. Then show him who owns the credit fund. The question changed the room again. Marcus looked at his attorney. She searched the attachment, then opened the ownership disclosure. Her eyes stopped on a familiar surname. The managing partner is Daniel Voss. Marcus did not look at the page. He looked directly at Richard. Your brother? Richard's silence lasted 1 second too long. Hannah picked up the espresso pot and replaced Marcus's cold cup with a fresh one. This time, no one laughed when she returned to the table. Marcus kept his eyes on Richard Voss. The private dining room had changed in a way no expensive setting could hide. A few minutes earlier, Richard had controlled the pace of every answer. Now the attorney beside Marcus was reading the ownership disclosure line by line, while the Northline executives avoided looking at one another. Is Daniel Voss your brother? Marcus asked again. Richard took a measured breath. Yes, but the fund is independently managed. Did you disclose that relationship to the investment committee? The connection was not material to the acquisition. Hannah set the espresso pot back on the service table. It becomes material if the company is likely to need the fund's emergency loan. Richard turned toward her. You do not know that the facility will be used. Northline's cash balance suggests it was designed to be used. Marcus looked at the chief financial officer. When was the emergency credit agreement signed? The man opened a digital folder and searched for the date. 3 months ago. Before our preliminary offer, Marcus said. Yes. Who introduced the lender? The answer came slowly. Richard's office. The attorney stopped writing. Marcus placed both hands flat on the table, not in anger, but to keep the decision in front of him from moving any faster than the facts. Open every liquidity memorandum sent during due diligence. Richard leaned forward. That is not necessary. The risk was modeled. Then the model will support you. Marcus's voice was quiet. Open it. The attorney connected her secure laptop to the deal room and searched the archived files. A warning report appeared with a date 3 weeks earlier. Its subject line read, Immediate Cash Covenant Exposure Following Change of Control. Marcus read the title twice. I never received this. Richard's expression tightened. It was preliminary. Who removed it from the executive summary? Richard did not answer. The attorney opened the document history. The report had been uploaded by an outside accounting team, reviewed by Richard, and then moved into a restricted folder hours before the final presentation packet was assembled. Hannah watched the sequence without surprise. She had seen the same pattern years earlier. A warning rarely vanished by accident. First, someone called it incomplete. Then someone moved it where fewer people could see it. Eventually, the decision was made as if the warning had never existed. Marcus looked at her. How did you recognize all of this so quickly? Hannah hesitated. The answer belonged to a life she had worked hard not to explain in dining rooms. I was a credit analyst. Richard gave a dismissive laugh. Hannah did not look at him. 3 years ago, I reviewed a manufacturing company that used receivable sales and delayed vendor payments to hide a cash shortage. I refused to sign the favorable rating. Marcus studied her more carefully. What happened? My accounts disappeared. Then my position did. The simplicity of the answer made the room quieter. Marcus glanced toward the restaurant check near the edge of the table. Every charge had been verified down to the dollar. Yet a warning involving hundreds of millions had been placed in a restricted folder because one man decided it was inconvenient. Did your former employer know the report was accurate? He asked. They knew enough to avoid putting the disagreement in writing. Richard folded his arms. This is becoming personal. Hannah finally turned toward him. No, personal is why the warning was hidden. The numbers are still business. The attorney opened the preliminary report. Northline was projected to fall below the required $80 million in unrestricted cash within 60 days of the acquisition. If that happened, the emergency credit fund controlled by Daniel Voss would have the right to charge the origination fee, impose restrictive covenants, and take a secured interest in key distribution assets. Marcus looked at Richard. You told me the acquisition needed no additional financing. Under the base case, you buried the other case. I protected the transaction from unnecessary panic. Marcus reached for his father's fountain pen, then stopped before touching it. My father used to say that risk does not disappear when you remove it from the first page. He looked at the unsigned agreement. It only becomes more expensive. Richard's composure finally cracked at the edges. If you delay tonight, the seller may walk. Hannah looked at the report. If you do not delay, the lender may own the leverage before you own the company. Marcus closed the signature folder. The sound was soft, but every person at the table understood what it meant. The deal was no longer waiting for a signature. It was waiting for the truth. Marcus asked the Northline executives to remain seated while his attorney placed the deal room under legal hold. No one was accused of a crime. No one was prevented from leaving. But every company-issued message, report, and approval record connected to the acquisition would now be preserved before another file could be moved or renamed. Richard Voss stared at the closed signature folder as if the leather cover had become an insult. You are overreacting to a downside scenario, he said. Marcus looked toward the chief financial officer. Is the 60-day cash projection accurate? The man shifted in his chair. It is possible under a severe case. Hannah stood near the service table, listening to the answer rather than the tone. What assumptions make it severe? She asked. Richard turned sharply. This is not her meeting. Marcus did not look away from the chief financial officer. Answer her. The man opened the projection and read from the model. It assumed fuel prices remained elevated, 2 major customers paid late, and the receivables facility was not renewed at its current advance rate. Hannah moved closer to the table. Those are not extreme assumptions. Fuel prices are already above the model. The 2 customers have stretched payment terms for 3 quarters, and the lender already reduced the advance rate. The attorney confirmed each point from the supporting files. The so-called severe case was simply the current situation written without optimism. Marcus opened the supplier aging report. Several maintenance vendors had invoices more than 90 days past due. One fuel provider had placed Northline on shorter payment terms. Another had requested partial payment before delivery. How long can the fleet operate if vendors tighten credit? He asked. The chief financial officer rubbed one hand across the edge of the binder. It depends on route volume. Give me the honest answer. Weeks, not months. The words changed the scale of the problem. 8,000 employees depended on a company whose profits looked strong, while essential suppliers were already losing trust. Marcus looked at the Northline chief executive. Did you know? I knew liquidity was tight. Richard said your acquisition would solve it. Hannah looked at Richard. By using emergency debt from your brother's fund. Richard's voice hardened. The facility would stabilize the company. At 14% interest, the attorney said, with an 8% fee and security over distribution assets. Marcus turned the restaurant check over and studied the itemized charges on the back. $17 for bottled water. $42 for espresso service. Every number small enough to be questioned had been clearly listed. The largest financial risk in the room had been hidden behind a phrase called contingency liquidity. How much would Daniel's fund earn in the first year? He asked. The attorney calculated silently, then entered the figures into her laptop. If the full $200 million were drawn, fees and interest could exceed $40 million. Richard leaned forward. That is only if the company fails to recover. Hannah answered before Marcus could. The loan terms make recovery harder. Cash leaves faster, asset restrictions increase, and management loses flexibility. The lender earns more when the borrower stays weak. Marcus looked at her. Could Northline survive without that facility? Hannah considered the question carefully. Not under the current structure. But survival and this transaction are not the same thing. She pointed to the customer deposit schedule. The company has a profitable core. The problem is that future cash has been spent, expenses have been delayed, and the purchase price assumes none of that matters. Marcus opened the preliminary valuation. It treated the reported earnings as sustainable and added a premium for growth. What would you remove? He asked. The inflated earnings from capitalized repairs. The temporary benefit from delayed vendor payments. The receivables cash that will not repeat. Then I would add the working capital Northline actually needs to operate. Richard gave a cold laugh. And what does the waitress think the company is worth? Hannah did not react to the word. She studied the figures for several seconds. Less than the current offer by at least $200 million, before accounting for the debt risk. Marcus looked at the chief financial officer. The man did not disagree. For the first time that evening, Richard's confidence had no one supporting it. Marcus slid his father's fountain pen away from the agreement and placed it beside Hannah's fresh espresso. The signing is canceled, he said. Not the company, not the jobs, the price and the story we were given. He turned to his attorney. Commission an independent forensic review tonight. Then he looked at Hannah. I want you present when they begin. Hannah met his gaze. Only if my role is written down, my work is paid, and no conclusion is edited without my approval. Marcus nodded once. Agreed. Richard pushed back his chair. You are trusting a server over your investment chief. Marcus looked at the closed folder between them. No, I am trusting the numbers you hoped I would not read. The forensic review began before midnight in a conference room 3 floors above the restaurant. Marcus Ellison's attorney arranged read-only access to the acquisition files, while an outside accounting firm joined through a secure connection. Hannah Pierce sat at the far end of the table in the same black service uniform she had worn through dinner. A temporary consulting agreement lay beside her, signed by Marcus and reviewed by counsel. It stated that her findings would be preserved in full and attached to the final report. Richard Voss had been removed from the review process pending an internal conflict inquiry. His company accounts were placed under legal hold, but no conclusions had yet been announced. Marcus understood the difference between suspicion and proof. Hannah opened the working capital schedule first. Start with the cash balance, she said. The outside accountant shared the ledger on the screen. Northline reported $112 million in total cash, but $34 million belonged to customer deposits. $21 million was pledged against fuel contracts, and another $20 million was held in restricted insurance accounts. That leaves $37 million the company can use freely, Hannah said. Marcus looked toward the projection. Less than half the covenant requirement. The accountant nodded. And the lender measures compliance on the last business day of the quarter. The date was 23 days away. Hannah turned to the receivables facility. Northline had sold nearly $140 million in customer invoices over 3 quarters, receiving cash early in exchange for fees and future collections. The program had made operating cash appear stronger than it was. Now the lender planned to reduce the percentage advanced on new invoices. When that happens, Hannah explained, Northline receives less cash from the same sales. The gap arrives immediately. Marcus watched the figures move across the screen. How large? Between $28 and $35 million in the first month, the accountant said. The next file contained the fuel payment Hannah had noticed. It was not a routine invoice. Northline had entered a price protection agreement that required a cash settlement if diesel prices moved beyond a certain range. That payment was due 12 days before the covenant test. $43 million, the attorney said. Marcus leaned back. The company did not have 12 months. Without new financing, it might have less than 4 weeks. Hannah opened the maintenance records. Hundreds of truck repairs had been capitalized as long-term improvements, allowing Northline to spread the expense across future years. The treatment raised reported profit but did nothing to restore cash. Can the classifications be defended? Marcus asked. The accountant paused. Some can. Many cannot. Hannah pointed to a group of invoices for brake systems, tires, and routine engine work. These keep existing vehicles operating. They do not create new long-term value. The adjustment reduced annual earnings by almost $60 million. Marcus looked at the original acquisition price. It had been built on profits that disappeared under ordinary accounting. His father's fountain pen rested beside the untouched report, no longer a symbol of confidence, but a reminder that signatures outlive the excitement surrounding them. The attorney then opened the email archive connected to the restricted liquidity report. Richard had received the warning 3 weeks earlier. He forwarded it to Daniel Voss with one sentence. If the buyer closes before quarter end, the facility activates exactly as modeled. Daniel replied 6 minutes later. Then keep the covenant discussion out of the main room. Marcus read the exchange without speaking. Hannah did not look at Richard's absence. She looked at the sequence of dates. The loan was not a backup plan, she said. It was part of the acquisition strategy. The outside accountant agreed. Once Marcus purchased Northline, the change of control provision would accelerate several payment requirements. Those payments would deepen the shortage, force the emergency loan, and place distribution centers under the lender's security agreement. Daniel's fund would earn fees while gaining leverage over the company's most valuable assets. Marcus closed the email file. Could Northline be saved without rewarding them? Hannah studied the revised numbers. Yes, but not with this price, this debt structure, or this timetable. What would it require? A lower purchase price, fresh working capital, direct agreements with suppliers, and full disclosure to the workforce and lenders. The attorney added that Richard's removal would also require notification to the investment committee. Marcus nodded. Do it. Then he looked at Hannah. Would you remain through the restructuring review? She did not answer immediately. Only if saving the company does not become an excuse to hide what happened. Marcus glanced at the clock, then at the report she had forced everyone to read. The truth is no longer the obstacle, he said. It is the first condition. By sunrise, the first version of the rescue plan was spread across the conference table in 12 marked sections. The numbers were no longer arranged to flatter anyone. Northline's reported profit had been reduced, its usable cash separated from restricted funds, and every delayed payment placed back where it belonged. Marcus Ellison stood near the windows while the city below shifted from darkness to gray morning. Hannah Pierce remained seated with the outside accountants, reviewing a schedule of supplier obligations. She had changed nothing about her appearance. The black service uniform still made her look out of place among lawyers and investment advisors, yet no one in the room questioned why she was there. We can stabilize payroll for 8 weeks, the lead accountant said, but only if the seller accepts a lower price and the lenders waive the quarter-end covenant. Marcus turned from the window. What happens if they refuse? Hannah answered before the accountant could. Then Northline enters a formal restructuring, and the value falls further. They have more reason to negotiate than to pretend. Marcus looked at the proposed purchase price. The new figure was $230 million below the original offer. It included a dedicated working capital reserve, direct payment plans with critical vendors, and protection for wages and employee benefits. The board will call this a retreat, he said. Hannah closed the supplier file. Only if they think the original price was real. His attorney connected the investment committee by secure video. 6 faces appeared on the screen, each carrying the fatigue of being called before dawn. Marcus explained the liquidity gap, the hidden covenant warning, and Richard Voss's undisclosed connection to the emergency credit fund. He did not soften his own responsibility. I relied on the summary because I wanted the deal to confirm my judgment, he said. That made it easier for someone to decide what I would not see. One committee member asked who discovered the problem. Marcus looked toward Hannah. The person I asked for advice as a joke. Hannah did not smile. Marcus continued. She gave the only answer in the room that matched the cash. The committee requested her analysis. Hannah moved closer to the screen and explained the situation without jargon. Northline had spent money from future collections, delayed bills that still had to be paid, and counted restricted funds as though they were freely available. The company was not worthless. It was simply priced as if time, debt, and trust carried no cost. When she finished, one board member asked whether she believed the acquisition should proceed. Not as written, Hannah said. But walking away without a restructuring plan could leave 8,000 workers paying for decisions they did not make. The answer changed the discussion. Until then, the choice had been framed as buy or abandon. Hannah replaced it with a third option, buy honestly, at a price that acknowledged the damage, and protect the operating business from the people who had designed profit around its weakness. The committee approved negotiations under 3 conditions. An independent monitor would oversee the revised financial reporting. Supplier payments and employee obligations would receive priority. Richard and any related party would be excluded from financing decisions. Marcus added a fourth. Every material warning goes into the main report, not an appendix. The vote passed. When the call ended, Marcus placed his father's fountain pen beside the revised term sheet. You changed an $860 million decision with one sentence, he said. Hannah shook her head. The sentence only made you look at the pages that were already there. His attorney handed her a formal consulting agreement for the restructuring review. The document included her conditions, full access to relevant records, independent reporting authority, and written protection for any analyst who raised an evidence-based concern. Hannah read every line before signing. Marcus noticed the care she gave the modest consulting fee, the same care his team had failed to give the largest transaction of the year. My father checked every invoice twice, he said. He believed small numbers revealed character. Hannah returned the pen to him. Then perhaps the problem was never the size of the deal. Marcus looked at the revised report. The espresso beside him had gone cold again, but this time he did not replace it. He sat down, opened the first page, and began reading from the beginning. The revised negotiations began that afternoon with none of the ceremony Marcus Ellison had planned the night before. There was no private dining room, no polished signature folder, and no promise that the acquisition would close before the markets opened. The seller's advisors joined from Northline's headquarters while Marcus's legal team presented the corrected cash position, the overstated earnings, and the immediate covenant risk. Hannah Pierce sat beside the outside accountants with the supplier's schedule open in front of her. When Northline's chief executive objected to the reduced price, Marcus did not argue from instinct. He asked Hannah to explain the difference. The original offer paid for profit the company has not actually earned in cash, she said. The revised offer sets aside money for payroll, fuel, repairs, and overdue suppliers before anyone counts growth. The seller's banker called the adjustment excessive. Hannah pointed to the $43 million fuel settlement due in less than 2 weeks. That payment does not become smaller because the meeting prefers a larger valuation. No one challenged the number. Marcus then proposed a protected working capital account that could not be redirected toward executive bonuses, acquisition fees, or related party loans. Northline's employees would be paid first. Critical vendors would receive written repayment plans. Pension contributions would remain current throughout the restructuring. In exchange, the seller would accept a lower purchase price and disclose every financing arrangement connected to Daniel Voss's fund. The negotiations lasted 5 hours. Each time the discussion drifted toward optimism, Hannah returned it to cash. Each time someone described the emergency loan as optional, she showed the payment calendar that made it nearly unavoidable under the old structure. By early evening, the seller agreed to open the remaining records. One file contained a draft announcement prepared before Marcus had even signed. It stated that Northline had secured strategic liquidity support from Daniel Voss's fund immediately following the acquisition. The wording confirmed what the email archive had already suggested. Richard had expected the emergency financing to begin almost at once. Another attachment listed an advisory fee payable to a consulting company controlled by him. The fee would have been triggered when the credit facility closed. Marcus read the amount slowly. $5 million. His attorney documented the conflict and referred the file to the investment committee for formal review. Richard's suspension became immediate and complete. His authority over company accounts, transactions, and personnel was removed pending an independent investigation. Marcus did not celebrate. The man had worked beside him for 11 years. Betrayal did not become less personal simply because it could be expressed in a spreadsheet. Hannah noticed Marcus looking at his father's fountain pen near the revised term sheet. "You trusted him," she said. "I trusted the version of the deal he knew I wanted. That is not the same mistake. It produces the same signature." Marcus accepted the distinction without defending himself. Near midnight, Northline's board approved the revised framework. The purchase price fell by $225 million. $100 million was placed into protected working capital. The emergency credit arrangement with Daniel Voss's fund was canceled. An independent monitor received authority to report directly to both boards and to employee representatives. The deal was not complete, but for the first time, the company's survival did not depend on hiding its weakness. As the attorneys prepared the new term sheet, Marcus placed his father's pen beside Hannah. "Read it before I use this." She reviewed the document line by line. On the final page, she found a clause allowing the buyer to delay pension contributions during the first quarter after closing. Marcus's advisors called it standard flexibility. Hannah crossed it out. 8,000 workers did not create this shortage, she said. Their retirement should not finance the correction. Marcus looked at the deleted clause, then nodded to the attorney. "Remove it." A clean page replaced the old one. Hannah read the paragraph again and returned the pen. This time, Marcus did not sign immediately. He looked around the table and asked a question no one had heard from him the night before. "What are we still missing?" 4 months later, Northline Freight was still operating, but it no longer depended on borrowed optimism. The acquisition had closed under the revised structure, with protected working capital, current pension contributions, and direct repayment agreements for critical suppliers. Fuel accounts were stabilized. Payroll remained uninterrupted. The emergency credit fund connected to Daniel Voss never entered the company. Its high fees, restrictive terms, and control rights disappeared with the old transaction. Richard Voss remained under independent review, and every conflict tied to the original deal had been disclosed to both boards. Marcus Ellison stood inside a Northline distribution center outside Columbus, Ohio, watching trucks leave beneath the pale light of an early morning shift. The building was not elegant. There were no brass lamps, white tablecloths, or private rooms. Forklifts moved across the concrete floor, dispatch screens changed by the minute, and hundreds of employees began work before most of the city was awake. Hannah Pierce stood beside him wearing a navy coat and an identification badge that read Independent Financial Review Consultant. She had completed her forensic accounting certification 2 weeks earlier. The title did not make her more intelligent than she had been at the Calder house. It only gave the world a label for what had already been there. Marcus held his father's fountain pen in one hand and a final restructuring report in the other. "The board approved the new cash controls," he said. "No executive can remove a material warning from the main report without written review." Hannah turned another page. "And the employee representatives?" "They received the same liquidity summary as the lenders." "Good." She closed the report. Around them, drivers checked route assignments while maintenance crews inspected vehicles that had once carried repair costs hidden inside asset schedules. The numbers were no longer being arranged to protect pride. They were being used to protect decisions. Marcus looked toward the loading bays. 8,000 people kept their jobs because you noticed what my team ignored." Hannah shook her head. "They kept their jobs because the company still had a real business underneath the bad financing. And because you stopped me from signing." She looked at the pen in his hand. "You stopped yourself. I only showed you where to look." Marcus smiled faintly. Months earlier, he might have rejected the distinction. Now he understood it. At the next board meeting, he introduced a new policy requiring every major investment to include a dissenting analysis prepared by someone who had no incentive to approve the deal. Hannah helped design the process, but she refused a permanent executive title. She preferred independent work, where her conclusions could not be softened by loyalty to one company. Her first contract after Northline came from a regional bank that had once declined to interview her. This time, she accepted only after adding a clause protecting the full publication of her findings. The Calder house remained part of the story, though neither Marcus nor Hannah returned there for celebration. On the anniversary of the night they met, the restaurant mailed Marcus a copy of the original dinner check. $42 for espresso service. $17 for bottled water. Numbers small enough that everyone had reviewed them. Marcus framed the check beside the revised Northline term sheet in his office. Beneath both, he placed one sentence: profit can be arranged. Cash must still arrive. What do you think changed the outcome more? Hannah's financial knowledge or her willingness to speak when the room expected her silence? Share your thoughts and subscribe if you believe quiet intelligence, dignity, and truth deserve to be heard.